My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do appreciate you being with me. Well, we're looking at the fact that Paul, in his discussion of resurrection in Romans 8, which of course is parallel to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talked about the redemption of creation. As I noted yesterday morning, all three futurist views have it to varying degrees an element of their theology and eschatology that says at some point of time in the future, Jesus is going to come out of heaven riding a literal physical cloud, coming as a 5'5" Jewish man, and he will destroy the heaven and earth, but not really. He will renovate it. And then he will live on the earth with mankind in a literal, material, physical kingdom on a physical heaven and earth. Well, is that what Paul had in mind when he talked about the redemption of creation in Romans chapter 8? You'll need to go back and look at in which I discussed the definition of creation. Creation in Romans 8 is not a reference to dirt, to rocks, bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. So what we're doing now is taking a look at the Old Testament background, the Old Testament source of the New Testament doctrine of the new heaven and the new earth. Isaiah 51 is one of those texts. While the term new heaven, new earth is not used, what we do find, as I shared with you yesterday, is reference to the Abrahamic promises. And of course, the promise to Abraham included what? Heavenly city, heavenly country, resurrection. There's the redemption of creation right there in the Abrahamic promise. Well, I pointed out that in the promise of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, God said, a law will go forth from me. This is the new covenant. And by the way, in Jeremiah 31, 29 and following, in the promise of the new creation, you have the promise of the new creation. New covenant, new creation. They go hand in hand in Scripture. Now, notice what God says. A law will go forth from me, and justice will rule, justice will reign. And he says this, lift up your eyes to the heavens, look on the earth beneath, for the heavens will vanish away like smoke, the earth will grow old like a garment, and those who dwell in it will die in like manner. But my salvation will be forever, and my righteousness will not be abolished. So here we find, in the context of the promise of the new covenant, we find the promise of the passing away of heaven and earth, but with God's new covenant remaining. Do you see how God is putting the creation, the destruction of, quote, heaven and earth within a covenantal context? Now, if this is not a covenantal context, here's what we have. We have God promising the new covenant at the time when literal heaven and earth will be destroyed. Well, wait a minute. Hasn't the new covenant been given? Folks, do you realize that many in the dispensational world do not believe that the promised new covenant has been established? I wrote a little booklet entitled The New Covenant, Future Fulfilled. It's on my website. You need to check that out. But that's right. The dispensational world, many of the leading proponents claim that the new covenant promised in Isaiah 51, promised in Jeremiah, that new covenant has not been established. Well, what covenant did Jesus die to confirm? Galatians 3, verse 15. This I say after the manner of men, though, even though it's a man's covenant, if it is confirmed, no man disannuls or adds thereto. And it was by means of his death on the cross that Jesus confirmed the new everlasting covenant, Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 15. When Jesus took the cup and blessed it, he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant." What new covenant did he have in mind? So, when we realize that Isaiah is putting this destruction of heaven and earth within the context of the giving of the new covenant, we're confronted with some choices. If it is the case that the new covenant has been given, then the destruction of heaven and earth has taken place. God said, "A law will go forth from my mouth, justice and righteousness will rule. I will destroy heaven and earth, but my law," that is, my righteousness, "will never pass away." And by the way, if those words here in Isaiah 51, "My salvation will be forever, my righteousness will not be abolished," if that sounds familiar, it's reiterated by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 as he talks about the destruction of the temple, which, by the way, according to Josephus, it was called heaven and earth. It was their covenant world. That temple represented their covenant world, their covenant creation. So here is God in Isaiah 51 predicting the giving of a new covenant, the destruction of heaven and earth so that that new covenant would remain. And Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem and the temple said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away. My word," that's the new covenant of Isaiah 51, "will never pass away." This is covenant, folks. It's a covenant discussion. Let me reiterate this. You must catch the power of this. It's incredible. Okay? Heaven and earth would pass away when God gave the new covenant. Now, very quickly, do you realize, folks, that the amillennialists and the postmillennialists say that the gospel ceases to function at the second coming of Christ? Well, that means the new covenant passes away. That's right. And yet, what does Isaiah 51 say? My righteousness, that is the law, the new covenant, will never be abolished. Look, folks, you can't affirm the end of the Christian age, i.e. the time when the gospel will cease to function, without affirming that the gospel will be abolished. I mean, you just can't, that's not possible. So, God would give the new covenant, and the old heaven and the old earth would pass away, but the new covenant, that law of righteousness, would never be destroyed, never pass away. The passing of an old creation, the remaining, the abiding of the eternal, everlasting, indestructible, never to be abolished new covenant. Oh, but you know what? Isaiah 51 is not through demonstrating for us that this destruction of heaven and earth and the remaining of the everlasting covenant and the consequent and subsequent new heaven and new earth is all about covenant. In fact, the language is more than graphic, more than explicit, more than undeniable. Well, we got more from Isaiah 51. You don't want to miss it. So we'll see you on the flip side.